This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 202 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. As a lot of you guys know, I'm a new dad. My daughter's a little over 4 months old now, so I haven't gotten a lot of sleep this football season. You may find me responding to tweets at 3:30 in the morning because I can't sleep after waking up to help my daughter. One of those can't fall asleep moments happened to me on Tuesday morning. The week's games were over, so I decided to open up my ESPN and Yahoo fantasy apps to just stare at my fantasy scores, because there was literally nothing better to do that early in the morning. And while doing that, I thought to myself, hey, I'll throw in some waiver claims. I remembered that I wanted to try to add Kenneth Dixon and Damian Williams, so I went to the waiver wire to try to add them. On my rosters on both sites, so both on ESPN and Yahoo, I had a player in the IR spot, and he was still listed as out at the time. For those of you who don't know, when a player gets the out designation, he can go in an IR spot on most fantasy platforms. He doesn't actually have to be on IR. And when that happens, when you put a player in that spot, it opens up an extra bench spot for you. So a lot of you guys know the exercise of waiting later in the week for a player like Kerryon Johnson to be officially ruled out. Because when that happens, you can slot him into your IR spot and then pick up a flyer off the waiver wire. Maybe a handcuff or something. I've done that all year in multiple leagues. I've been doing that for multiple years. But I had never been in one of those apps or on one of those sites the following week while that player still had the out designation. Because apparently there's a period of time between when the game ends and when those designations go back to being questionable. So I made waiver claims while those players were still technically out. And they were technically still able to be in that IR spot. But usually when I go and make waiver claims, I'm not able to unless I move that IR player back to my bench because he's no longer IR eligible. Not in this case though. Because when I made my claims, all because of my 4-month-old daughter, it was early enough to where players still had that out designation. So I went to Twitter and I asked people if they had done this before and if it worked. And of course, there's about a 50-50 split between people who said that it worked and others who said it definitely wouldn't work. That if I put these claims in, I would not be able to get these players because it wouldn't process. And by the way, I'm always fascinated by people who just say things. They've never actually tried something out and they don't actually know, but they answer with such conviction. What I found out was that there's a large number of people who have done this before. And that's not surprising. There have been Reddit posts on it. Basically, if you can make your claims before your players who were out become questionable, then they actually will process. Those claims will process. The problem is you can't change those claims in the system or else they'll disappear. So when the claim is made, don't touch anything. Let it be. But this is just a long-winded way of saying that yes, it works. You can essentially add an extra bench spot to your lineup early in the week by making super early waiver claims if you have someone in your IR spot. And I wanted to share that with you guys because it's a nice little hack. And for the record, I'm not even close to taking credit here. Thousands of people know that this exists. People were actually yelling at me for not knowing that it exists. I'm just late to the party. Anyway, we've got some good questions for this week's show, but before I dig in, I wanted to remind you guys about the NumberFire Podcast Network FanDuel free roll that we've been running for listeners each week this season. With the free roll, you can win FanDuel points and NumberFire premium subscriptions. Last week, I'm Just Tired took home the top prize with a score of 198.68. They had big days out of Juju Smith-Schuster, Amari Cooper, and George Kittle. So for that, they get 3 free months of NumberFire premium access and a ton of free FanDuel points to be used on entries. To enter the Week 15 free roll, your URL is fanduel.com/league/gym. That's fanduel.com/league/gym. This first question is from @207Pablo. As the season's closing, what are you paying attention to in preparation for next season? I like this question a lot because it's not something that I've ever really thought about before. What I realized after thinking it through, though, was that I'm often just watching younger players towards the end of the seasons to see how they look because, number one, teams are often letting young players get some run at the end of the season, but number two, a lot of those guys will then get bigger opportunity the following year. That's really the biggest thing, and that's the only thing that I could really think of. I'm generally evaluating how I always do, but with newer players getting a run, it's always fun to get an early glimpse of what those guys are all about. This next question is from @LouDiamondDog. What is your take on the Tennessee backfield this week? Also, with Foles at the helm, how are the Eagles' skill position players impacted? So first off, with Foles, I think you have to downgrade everyone. I know Foles went on his run last year and he looked great, but we've got a larger sample of Nick Foles not being as great too. And he looked pretty average to start the season, albeit with probably worse weapons at his disposal. But I wouldn't assume skill players in Philly will produce as they usually do. With Tennessee, over the last 3 weeks, Derrick Henry has seen his snap rate rise above 40%. From basically week 6 through week 11, he was hovering the 20 to 33% range. It honestly hasn't resulted in much volume, but I think that's noteworthy nonetheless. He's seeing more snaps, and he was seeing more snaps prior to last week. And I also think it's hard for Tennessee to just sit back and see what happened last week and not want to get Henry the ball a little bit more. You know, earlier in the season, I was on Team Dion Lewis given the way that they were splitting up that backfield. I wasn't like unbelievably high on him. I just really preferred him to Derrick Henry. It's why Henry was a sell after week 1 in my weekly 15 transactions column. But guys, Lewis has been really bad at running the football this year. According to NumberFire's success rate metric, which measures the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a running back, Lewis has a 31% success rate this year. That's second worst among the 58 running backs with 50 or more carries. Now, Derrick Henry is the type of player who kind of benefits from a metric like this, but even still, behind that same offensive line in that same situation, he ranks 29th. So like I said, given all of this, I think that we could see more work going Henry's way. It's a good matchup for the running backs too, because the Giants have been worse at stopping the run since trading away Snacks Harrison. This next question is from @WhatTheChain. Just promoted 2 guys from my taxi squad in Ian Thomas and Deshaun Hamilton. I kind of want to play them, but it's hard to trust guys who have played so little. Where do you draw the line when making a lineup decision? I mean, I think it's all unique. Every specific decision is unique in its own way. But if we have a limited sample on a player, the easiest thing to do to see if they'll be viable in fantasy is simply to look at competition. If there's not a lot of competition on their own team, then they're going to see the field. And if they'll see the field, then they'll have opportunity to score fantasy points. So both Ian Thomas and Deshaun Hamilton may have limited samples, but they're both locks to see a lot of snaps in their offenses given the lack of alternatives. We don't know how special they are as talents, but half the battle is just seeing snaps, because that leads to targets, which then leads to fantasy points. This next one's from @Reno Taft Rockets. 2 league mates are upset we don't do bye weeks in our Dynasty League. They were the 1 and 2 seeds and they were eliminated, which left me to play a sub 500 team. They would like the commish to eliminate the 7th and 8th seeds and install bye weeks. I voted against bye weeks. Easier road. So there wasn't really a question here, but I just wanted to add a comment that the entire point for bye weeks is to have an easier road. You're rewarding the teams who were good across a larger sample size in the regular season. So they should get bye weeks. They should be rewarded, because we should reward teams that were good across multiple weeks rather than just 1 week. And by the way, if you've got a league with 12 teams or even 14 teams, you shouldn't have 8 teams make the playoffs. That's way too many. There's almost no reason to even try in the regular season at that point. But like I said, there was technically no question with this one, but I'm a big fan of rewarding teams with buys. This next question is from @Charismatic. For those of us waiting in the waiver wire tight end cesspool, who are the best streaming options this week and next? Ian Thomas, Uzama? God, I hate tight ends. Yeah, I hate tight ends too. I've been providing streamers on the show all week for this week, and I have to say, tight end streaming really isn't anything that you can prepare for at this point. You're really just finding guys who are filling in for injury, or you're just reacting to how teams are utilizing their tight ends. Blake Jarwin for this week is a really good example of that latter situation. He ran a lot of routes last week. He saw a lot more volume, so we're just hoping and praying that they're going to utilize him more. So I don't have tight end streamers for next week. And I'll just name some defenses for next week that I think are in good spots that might be on your waiver wire. I like Tennessee against Washington. Dallas against Tampa Bay could be okay. The Colts against the Giants, Cleveland against Cincinnati, and then the Dolphins against the Jags. The Dolphins were actually the team that I happened to mention on Tuesday's 15 transaction show. So I hope that helps. This next question is from @Ryan Schwenk. What's your approach when you are projected to get smoked in a matchup? For example, I've tossed around Allen or Jackson over Russell Wilson, even though Wilson is safer. I think it's fine to look for high variance players, but I also think that fantasy managers misunderstand the notion of what that means. For instance, in your example, you're talking about Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson over Russell Wilson for basically higher upside. If you're getting smoked, you want the highest possible outcome. But what makes Russell Wilson not a high upside player? What gives Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson more of a ceiling than Russell Wilson? I understand they'll go for more rushing yards, but Wilson has games of 25 and 26 fantasy points this year. That's just about where Josh Allen's ceiling has been. And Lamar Jackson has yet to really have that blow-up contest. And like you noted, Wilson is still giving you a better floor. So basically what I'm saying is we've seen Russell Wilson go nuts before. Russell Wilson has shown us that he has a very high ceiling in fantasy football. So I don't know if looking strictly at ceiling like that at quarterback is that worthwhile. I think it makes a lot more sense at wide receiver where we have players who can serve very different functions. And there's a lot of variance inherently at that position. I think it's fine to approach things this way, but remember, you don't need absolutely everyone in your lineup to hit their ceiling to win. Sometimes just getting players in there like Russell Wilson who have both a floor and a reasonable ceiling is fine, all while trying to hit the higher range of outcomes at other positions. You more than likely don't need the higher range of outcomes to be hit across your entire lineup. But we also probably overrate our ability to predict this. As I always say, you should just try to be optimal. This last question is from @WillieV. For playoff seeding tiebreaker, do you prefer total points or head-to-head record? And this considers that each team plays each other at least once. What's your take one way or the other? My take is easily points scored. Head-to-head record just says, on this day, this team happened to be better. And unlike the NFL, you can't play defense in fantasy football. So let's just say that your opponent scored 180 points on you in week 7, and you put up 160. And 160 is usually a really good score in your league. But you lost. If you finish with 200 more regular season points than that opponent did, then chances are you have the more consistent and better team. Your team is probably better. In other words, the opponent just got lucky in that given week. And I don't think that should be rewarded. You should care a lot more about what happened across the 13 regular season games than just that one singular contest. And like I said, this isn't the NFL. I have zero control over what your team does in a given week, even if I'm facing you. In the NFL, it's different. If the Steelers are playing the Ravens, they're controlling how well the Ravens perform. They can stop them on defense. They can beat them on offense. In fantasy, you're sort of just existing and crossing your fingers that your opponent doesn't do as well. So it's not really a true matchup. So don't use head-to-head as a tiebreaker. It's kind of stupid when you're not able to play actual defense. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all you guys for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And I'm also on Twitter @LateRoundQB. You can follow me on there for some really, really bad dad jokes. Thanks, everyone. Hope you all enjoy the weekend.